In a darkened tent, surrounded by the full might of the Assyrian army, a lone woman made a fearless and fateful choice that would change the course of history for the Israelite people forever. The story of Judith is a little-known piece of history that many Bibles do not include. But who was she, and how did she get there? King Nebuchadnezzar reigned over the great empire of Assyria, the mightiest military power of its time. As his empire grew, his heart became set on war and conquest. He grew angry that the Western nations, proud of their independence, refused to join him in battle. Outraged, he summoned his most fearsome general, Holofernes, and gave him an urgent mission to sweep through the land and crush anyone who would not bow to his command. Eager to obey his king, Holofernes marched forth, leading an enormous army that darkened the ground with its numbers. City after city fell before his might. Their walls were shattered and their people scattered or slain. No one who opposed him was safe, for his orders were to destroy not only the soldiers, but the gods that they trusted in, to prove that none could stand against the power of Assyria. As his campaign moved to the west, panic quickly began to spread. People saw the smoke rising in the distance and heard rumors of the terrible crimes being committed, striking fear into their hearts. Eventually, the fearsome army arrived at the gates of Judea, camped ominously around the small fortified city of Bethulia. From its strategic position on a mountain pass, Bethulia was the key to the entire region. If it fell and was captured, the heart of Israel would be laid open and bare for conquest. Inside the city, the people were terrified of the mighty force that lay outside their gates. Supplies were gathered, defenses were strengthened, and prayers lifted in desperation. The elders debated among themselves what the best course of action would be. Should they resist and trust in the Lord, or surrender and hope to save the lives of their people? As the enemy army circled around the city, cutting off their water supplies and crushing their hopes, the people of Bethulia felt more and more helpless. The heavens seemed silent, and their courage wilted like the grass under the sun. But God had not forgotten his people. And in the heart of Bethulia, someone was watching, praying, waiting for the moment when their deliverance would come from the most unlikely hands. The siege continued, and water grew more difficult to find. The young ones cried out for a drink, and the old collapsed from their thirst. Even the once strong men who'd boasted about their bravery felt themselves becoming faint, and the will of the people began to crack. Among the defenders of the city, Uzziah and the elders tried to calm the storm of despair. They pleaded with the people to hold out a little longer, to wait for the Lord to hear and answer their prayers. In the midst of this despair, however, hope began to stir in an unexpected place. Judith, a widow of noble character, had mourned her husband for many years in quiet devotion. Clothed in sackcloth and often fasting for days at a time, she was well known in the community, not for her beauty, although it was great, but for her faith. While others around her fell prey to despair and doubt, she had stood firm. When the people cried for surrender, she turned her eyes to heaven. However, she saw with concern that the elders had begun to waver, that they were speaking of making terms with the enemy if God did not act soon. Her soul burned within her at these words and the murmurs she heard in the streets. How long would they test the Lord? Had they forgotten the God who had parted seas and shattered armies? The people failed to remember that their strength was not in the sword, but in the hand of the Almighty, who had always been their protector. Judith rose from her mourning. The time had come for courage, for action. She would rise up, not as a warrior, but as a servant of the Most High. No one suspected what she would go on to do. But in heaven, a path was being prepared. The Lord was about to stir the enemy camp with fear, and he would do so through the hands of a woman, chosen and set apart for such a time as this. Night fell heavy upon Bethulia as the city bowed beneath the weight of its thirst and fear. But in one household, all was still, except for the quiet, steady movements of a woman preparing for war in the only way she knew how. Having prayed with fasting and ashes, Judith now stood prepared to make her move. She shed her widow's garments and clothed herself in splendid garments, robes of fine linen, decorated with bracelets and jewels that had been untouched for years. Her beauty, veiled for so long in mourning, now became a weapon that was honed for a single purpose: the deliverance of God's people. With her faithful maid at her side and her provisions packed, Judith descended from the city gates into the valley of the enemy. The guards watched in silence, both confused and amazed, as the figure of a woman walked alone towards the mighty army that waited to destroy them. And in the enemy camp, the Assyrian sentries were equally taken aback. Who was this beautiful vision approaching from the hills, speaking words of peace? Judith was quickly brought before the captains, and then to Holofernes himself, the man whose name had become a curse and spread fear in Israel. There, before the commander of tens of thousands, Judith neither trembled nor begged, as many would have done in her shoes. She spoke with cunning, hiding the truth of why she had come behind a flurry of flattering words. She claimed to know information about the ways of her people and promised that she could lead Holofernes to victory without shedding so much as a drop of blood. Her people, she said, were already doomed by their own sin. God had turned his face from them. Puffed up with pride and drunk on his conquest, Holofernes listened, enchanted. Never before had he seen such beauty and heard such words from the lips of a woman. Without thinking through the danger, he welcomed her into his camp and into his confidence. And so, for days, Judith stayed among the enemy, walking among them, but still obeying the God whom she served. She refused their food, eating only what she had brought with her. And every day she prayed with a beating heart, not for her safety, but for the hour to come when the Lord would deliver the enemy into her hands. And then, at last, the time came. A great feast was prepared in the Assyrian camp for Holofernes and his personal attendants, and he drank deeply, his pride boosted with the anticipation of an easy victory, now that Bethulia had supposedly lost its faith. He called for Judith to feast with him that night, eager for a chance to seduce her and claim her as his. But the Lord had written a different ending. As the Assyrian commander collapsed in a drunken sleep upon his couch, Judith stood alone in his tent. His attendants had been dismissed, and no one suspected what this seemingly helpless woman was capable of. Judith gazed at Holofernes, stretched out and snoring, the dread of nations, the man whose hands had burned cities and slaughtered innocent people. He had cursed the God of heaven, and now that very God had delivered him like a prey before the hunter. She whispered a prayer and then reached for his sword. It was heavy, a massive blade created for war. She gripped it tightly, and with one swift, brutal motion, she struck, and then struck again. The head of Holofernes fell from his shoulders. Judith caught her breath and stepped back. There was no scream, no cry for alarm, only the heavy breath of her maid, who waited faithfully outside. She wrapped the head in cloth, placed it in her food bag, and calmly stepped outside. They slipped out of the camp under the cover of night, and the same guards who'd welcomed her watched her go, unaware of what she had done. By the time she reached Bethulia, dawn had broken, and the city awoke to news of her return. The gates opened, and the people saw before them the answer to all their prayers. Raising the bloody trophy high above her head, Judith declared that the Lord had used the hands of a woman to strike down their enemy. Shouts rang through the streets. Tears turned to joy. The people, once on the edge of despair, now danced and praised God. When the Assyrian soldiers discovered their leader's lifeless body lying headless and dishonored, panic seized the camp. Fear filled their hearts, and they scattered like the wind. The men of Bethulia poured out of the city and chased after them, cutting them down as they ran. Soon the battlefield was silent, the dust settled, and the threat, which had terrified them just hours earlier, had disappeared like mist in the morning sun. Judith's fame spread far beyond Bethulia. Many came from other cities to thank her for what she had done, and tribes in every corner of the land rejoiced. For many years after, no enemy dared to lift a sword against Israel for fear of the woman who had slain Holofernes, the great general of Assyria. Watch this video next to listen to the full audiobook of the Book of Judith, one of the most beautiful and inspirational books in the Apocrypha.